He won't last. That's what her father said, not to me, not even to Elena. He said it to her Aunt Patricia in the hallway outside the restaurant bathroom, 2 hours into the first dinner I ever attended as Elena Vasquez's boyfriend. He thought the music was loud enough that no one outside the hallway could hear him. He was wrong. I heard every word, and I spent the next 3 years deciding whether to prove him right or prove him wrong. My name is Declan Marsh. I'm 32 years old. I run a construction crew in the kind of town where everyone eventually finds out what everyone else earns, and for a long time, I was the man Elena Vasquez's family had decided was not enough for her. Not educated enough, not connected enough, not polished enough to belong in the circle they had carefully built around their daughter. I want to tell you how that changed. But to do that honestly, I have to tell you first about the man I was before it changed. A man who was too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to show vulnerability, and almost too quiet to survive. Because here is the thing no one tells you about being underestimated by the family of the person you love. It doesn't just affect the dinners. It seeps into your bedroom at 2 in the morning when she's asleep and you're awake replaying conversations. It seeps into the silences after her Sunday phone calls. It seeps into the way you start calculating, always calculating, whether what you're building is going to be enough, and when, and for whom. I built some of the best work of my career during those 3 years. I was also, without fully realizing it, quietly disappearing into the effort. The man Elena was in love with was becoming a man who performed stability instead of feeling it. And she could see it happening, even if neither of us said so out loud, and it frightened her in ways she didn't have language for yet. So when Marco Vasquez had his heart attack in October of our 3rd year together, when the man who had spent 37 months quietly deciding I was temporary suddenly needed someone to be permanent, what happened in that hospital was not a simple reversal. It was more complicated than that. It was 3 years of pressure finding its release point. And the release didn't sound like victory. It sounded like a man in a hospital bed asking me why I was still there, and me not being entirely sure how to answer. Let me start at the beginning. The first dinner happened in April, 4 months into our relationship, at a restaurant called Torello's that Marco Vasquez had been going to since Elena was in middle school. White tablecloths. A wine list on cardstock. The kind of place where the lighting does most of the work and everyone instinctively speaks slightly, too quietly. Elena had told me almost nothing about what to expect, only that her father was particular, and that her Aunt Patricia would be there to balance things out. I had understood this to mean her father was difficult, and her aunt was his counterweight. I had not understood that Patricia was his counterweight in the specific way that made the voltage in the room tolerable rather than actually reducing it. I was already seated when Marco Vasquez walked in. He was 61 then, trim, with the kind of posture you only get from decades of standing in front of a courtroom, making arguments to people you need to convince. He had been a civil litigator for 30 years before he retired. He shook my hand at the table, and his grip was the exact kind of grip that is slightly firmer than it needs to be. Not a threat, an assessment. "Declan," he said, the way a man says a name he has already filed somewhere internal. "Elena tells me you're in construction." "I run my own crew," I said. "Residential renovation. Mostly, I have 7 guys. We do gut jobs, additions, some restoration work on older buildings." He nodded in the way a man nods when he's being polite about information that hasn't surprised him. "And you didn't finish your degree?" It wasn't quite a question. "I left after 2 years," I said. "My mother was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's. She needed someone full-time, and I was the only one available." He did not ask about my mother. He picked up his menu. Elena looked at the table. Over the next 90 minutes, Marco Vasquez asked me about margins, about liability exposure, about whether I carried business insurance, and what my claims history looked like. He asked about my 5-year plan in a tone that suggested he had heard a lot of 5-year plans from men my age and found them uniformly unreliable. He did not ask about my mother's condition, about why I had chosen restoration work over new construction, about what I enjoyed about the job, or about anything that would have told him who I was rather than what I owned. His sister Patricia watched me from across the table with the careful attention of someone taking notes she would deliver privately later. Alina ate her dinner and periodically offered small bridges, mentioning a project I described to her, citing a compliment a client had paid me, and each time, her father acknowledged the bridge with a polite nod and then rerouted the conversation back toward the quantifiable. In the parking lot afterward, while Patricia was getting her car and Marco was saying something to the valet, Elena took my arm and looked up at me with an expression I would come to know very well over the next 3 years. The expression that meant, "I'm sorry, and I don't know how to fix this, and I need you to not fall apart about it right now." "How are you doing?" she asked. "Fine," I said. "What did he say to you?" In the hallway, when I was ordering the second round, she paused. The pause itself was information. He asked if you had savings. "Did you tell him?" "I said you were responsible with money." I stood there with my keys and thought about the hallway where I had heard those 4 words through a gap in music that Marco Vasquez had apparently trusted more than he should have. "He won't last." Clear as a bell, not shouted, just said, the way you say a fact you've already decided. I had spent the whole dinner watching him look at me and confirming, one tablecloth-level conversation at a time, that he had already finished thinking about me before I walked through the door. I drove home alone. I sat in my truck in my driveway for 40 minutes and looked at the street and thought about whether this was survivable, not the dinner, but the arithmetic. The ongoing math of being with someone whose family had already subtracted you. I was 31 years old. I had a successful business and a serious relationship, and I was sitting in a truck in a driveway at 11 at night, trying to calculate whether I was willing to spend years being Marco Vasquez's footnote. I decided, sitting there, that I was. But I decided it the wrong way, by resolving to become undeniable, rather than by deciding the question simply didn't belong to him. That distinction mattered enormously, and I wouldn't understand how much until much later. Elena and I moved in together 8 months after that dinner, into a 2-bedroom in the east part of town with good light, and a landlord who left us alone. Her father sent a check made out to Elena, not to us, to Elena specifically, for $600, with a note that said, "For household expenses." I thanked him when Elena showed it to me, and then I went to make coffee and did not discuss it further, because I had already decided that discussing it would accomplish nothing, and that results would accomplish everything. This was my operating philosophy for the next 1.5 years. Build, demonstrate, let the evidence speak. It was not entirely wrong. It was also not enough, because it assumed the problem was a deficit of evidence rather than a deficit of willingness to see it. I had not yet grasped the difference between someone who has not seen proof and someone who does not want to be moved by it. Marco called Alina every Sunday. I learned the rhythm of those calls the way you learn the weather patterns of a place you're living. Not with resentment, exactly, but with the automatic adjustment of someone who knows what's coming. By the second month, I had already unconsciously begun clearing the room when her phone lit up with his name. I'd find a reason to be in the other room, or outside, or suddenly very interested in something in the garage. Not because I was afraid of what he was saying, because I had decided that what he was saying was not my business to know, and therefore not something I needed to let damage me. This was another mistake, and it was a more expensive one. The Sundays accumulated. Alina's shoulders would tighten in a specific way after those calls, a pulling in that I recognized as the physical effect of being asked to defend a choice to someone who was never going to fully accept the defense. She would be careful with her words for the rest of the evening. Not cold, not distant, just measured, like someone carrying a tray of something fragile across a room with an uneven floor. I told myself I was being respectful of her relationship with her father by staying out of it. I was actually being avoidant in a way that left her alone in the middle of a dynamic she hadn't asked for. She was being pulled in two directions every Sunday, and I was offering her the same thing in both directions, distance dressed up as space. Her father's distance came with criticism. Mine came with silence. Neither was the same as company. At our 2-year mark, I had grown the crew to 11. I had completed 3 full gut renovations in a neighborhood that was beginning to attract developer attention, and in November of that year, a man named Richard Stroud contacted me through an architect I'd worked with twice before. Stroud was a mid-size commercial developer, the kind who moves in a specific, well-connected orbit that neither announces itself nor needs to. He was putting together a mixed-use project, 32 units and ground floor retail, in a location that had historically underperformed. He wanted a subcontractor he could trust with the interior build-out. The architect had recommended me without my knowledge. The meeting with Stroud happened on a Thursday morning. He was a precise, compact man who asked 3 questions in the first 10 minutes and then spent the rest of the hour listening to my answers with the particular attention of someone who has been misled before and learned to hear the difference between confidence and certainty. At the end, he slid a folder across the table with a draft scope and said, "Think about whether this is something you want. If it is, call me by end of week." I called him by end of day. The contract was signed in March. The project was the largest I had ever taken on, 14 months, a budget that required me to expand my crew by 4 and acquire 2 pieces of equipment I'd been renting for years. Alina threw her arms around me when I told her at dinner and said I knew it. I knew it into my shoulder, and I held on to her for a long moment because it felt like something shifting, some ballast moving into a better configuration. The following Sunday, Marco called. By Monday morning, her shoulders were back where they had been. I finally asked. After 2 years of not asking, I asked. We were in the kitchen, she was washing a mug, water running, and I said quietly, "What does he say, Alana, on the Sundays? What does he actually say?" She stopped washing. The water kept running for a few seconds, and then she turned it off. She didn't turn around. "He says Stroud is the kind of man who burns through subcontractors," she said. "He says you don't have the relationships to survive it if Stroud decides he's done with you." She set the mug in the rack. "He says I need to be thinking about what happens to me if this falls through." I sat down at the kitchen table. I looked at the copy of the Stroud contract in front of me, the one with my signature on it, and I thought about what it meant, that in 2 years I had built an 11-person crew and completed some of the best residential work in the county, and the best Marco Vasquez had been able to do in response was find a new angle from which to predict my failure. "Elena," I looked at her back. "Do you believe him?" She turned around. She looked at me across the kitchen. And the pause before she answered was 3 seconds long. I counted. "I don't know," she said. "I think he just worries about me." 3 seconds. I replayed that pause for a long time afterward. I understood what it meant, not that she agreed with her father, but that she wasn't sure she disagreed. That 3 years of Sunday phone calls had done something to her certainty about us that she had not told me about. Maybe because she hadn't fully admitted it to herself. That the gap between the woman who threw her arms around me over the Stroud contract and the woman who stood in front of her father's voice and couldn't find a clean answer, that gap was growing in ways neither of us were naming. That was the second time I almost left. It was the night I came closest. I lay awake for hours while Alana slept. I thought about the geometry of it, the specific, suffocating shape of being loved by someone who was also afraid of you in the way her father had taught her to be afraid of you. Not afraid of me as a person, afraid of the version of me her father had installed in her mind, the contractor without a degree, the man without connections, the temporary choice her smart daughter had made and would eventually outgrow. I thought about whether the Stroud Project, the thing I had worked toward for 2 years as a form of argument against that fear, would actually move anything, whether any amount of evidence could compete with a voice that spoke to her every Sunday in her first language. I decided, lying there in the dark, that I was still not leaving. But for the first time, the decision didn't come from certainty. It came from something quieter and more specific. The way she had said I knew it. I knew it into my shoulder. The particular frequency of that. The way it landed in me as something I was not willing to let go of, just because it was being made difficult. I stayed. The decision was right. The reasoning was incomplete. And what happened next is what filled it in. The Stroud Project ran for 14 months. It ran well. Precisely well, the kind of well that creates a reputation rather than just a result. On time, 4 days under budget, with a written commendation from the project architect that Stroud included in the closeout package. More importantly, it ran well in ways that the people who hired Stroud watched and discussed. By the final month, 2 other developers had inquired about my availability. By the following spring, I had more work than I could take on without a second foreman, and I hired one. I let Alina tell her father about the project's success. I told her what the numbers looked like, and I described the commendation, and I then stepped back and watched. From a distance, I had learned to maintain, to see whether concrete, demonstrable results would do what 3 years of presence had not. They changed the temperature, not the verdict. The temperature. At family dinners, Marco Vasquez spoke to me about the project with the careful appreciation of a man acknowledging a fact he can't comfortably argue with. He asked follow-up questions. He was more precise with me, and precision was, I was learning, his version of respect. But the look, the particular quality of attention that said his assessment was suspended rather than concluded, that persisted. He had made a decision about me in a parking lot 3 years ago, and new information was being incorporated into the margins of that decision rather than overwriting it. Elena spent those dinners building small bridges. She had become, over 3 years, very skilled at this. The slight redirections, the affirmative asides, the careful translations of me into language she believed her father's framework could absorb. She was expending enormous energy on something that should not have required any energy at all. And I watched her do it with a sadness I didn't know what to do with. She was protecting her father from having to change his mind and protecting me from the evidence that he hadn't. She was keeping the peace between 2 people where only one of them was actually interested in conflict, and the effort was aging her in small ways she probably couldn't see. I wanted to tell her to stop. I couldn't find the words that would let me say that without sounding like I was asking her to choose. So I didn't say it. I built. I expanded. I hired the second foreman. I bought the equipment I'd been renting. I took on a project that put my work on a street where the people Marco Vasquez had lunch with could see it. And I waited, in my careful, proud, wrong-headed way, for the case to close itself. It didn't close itself. What happened instead was that October came, and Marco Vasquez had a heart attack in his office, and the case stopped mattering entirely. Elena's phone rang at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I was on site at the new project, second floor, framing inspection scheduled for the following week, when my phone buzzed with a text from her, Dad. Hospital. Can you come? No punctuation. That was the signal. I told my foreman to run the rest of the day. I got in my truck, and I drove at a speed I will not specify across 42 miles of state highway, and I did not think once, on that drive, about the 3 years. I thought about Elena in a hospital waiting room. I thought about the frequency of I knew it. I knew it. I thought about what she needed and how to get there fast. She was in the waiting room on the 2nd floor when I arrived. She stood up when she saw me, and I crossed the room, and she put her face into my chest and held on and didn't say anything for a while. I didn't say anything either. There wasn't anything useful to say. I just held on. Marco was in cardiac care. The attack had been significant. His assistant had found him slumped at his desk at roughly 2 in the afternoon. And the estimate was that he'd been there between 30 and 40 minutes before anyone noticed. The doctors were cautious in the way that doctors are cautious when they mean, we don't know yet. A procedure was scheduled for the following morning. The next 72 hours were the window. Elena's Aunt Patricia arrived at 5, flying in from 2 states over. She embraced Elena for a long time in the hallway, and when she released her, she looked at me over Elena's shoulder, not the usual careful sympathy, not the watchful monitoring I'd learned to expect from her. Something else. Direct, almost grateful. Like she had been carrying the weight of a specific hope for years and was relieved to see it had been justified. I stayed that first night. Elena asked me to, and I would have stayed without being asked, but she asked, and I said yes, and we sat in the waiting room together through visiting hours and into the dim quiet that hospital waiting rooms become after midnight. She fell asleep against my shoulder around 1 a.m., and I sat very still and let her sleep. And I looked at the ceiling of that waiting room and thought about the fact that the man down the hall, who had never believed I would last, was going to need me to last now, in the most basic possible way, and that this was not something I was angry about. It was just what was true. On the 2nd day, Marco was stable enough for short visits. Elena went in first, alone for 20 minutes, and came back with her eyes red but her posture less collapsed than it had been the night before. Then she said, "He wants to see you." I want to be honest about what I felt in that hallway. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't vindication. It was something closer to the feeling you get before a conversation you know is going to require everything from you, a particular kind of readiness, and underneath it, something that might have been grief. For the 3 years. For Elena's tired shoulders. For the $600 made out to her name. Marco was propped up at an angle against the hospital pillow, with his reading glasses folded on the tray table and 2 IV lines in his left arm. He looked smaller than he did at dinners, and for a moment that small difference rearranged everything. Not the content of 3 years, but the scale of it. He was 61 years old. He had nearly died alone in an office. He looked like a man who had recently encountered the edge of something and was still orienting to how close it had been. He looked at me when I came in, the same measuring look, but quieter, this time, lower in temperature. "You're still here," he said. "I am." "Elena called you." "She did." I came fast. He looked at the window. The light outside was the flat gray of mid-October. "You didn't have to stay the night," he said. It wasn't quite gratitude. It was somewhere between acknowledgement and the preliminary clearing of a throat before a longer statement. "I know," I said. He was quiet for a moment. The monitors beside him registered his pulse in small, steady peaks. Then, "Why?" Not a full sentence, not even a question, exactly, just the word, with a period at the end of it. I thought about saying something measured and strategic, something designed to land correctly with a man who valued precision. Instead, I said the thing I'd been thinking in that waiting room at 1 in the morning, while Alana slept against my shoulder. Because she loves you, I said. And she's frightened. And I'm not going to let her be frightened alone, because you and I have unresolved business. He looked at me then, directly, without the usual layer of appraisal. Something shifted in him. Not dramatically, just a notch. What do you think our unresolved business is? He asked. You decided I wasn't enough for her before you knew anything about me, I said. And you've been carrying that decision for 3 years without seriously reconsidering it. Alina has been trying to bridge that gap the whole time, and it's exhausting her. That's what's unresolved. He didn't flinch. I had expected him to redirect or deflect the trained litigator's move when a statement is accurate and damaging. Instead, he looked at the window again and was quiet for long enough that I thought he might be done with the conversation. Then, the Stroud project. What was your final margin? I told him. The number was specific, and I didn't soften it. He was quiet for another moment. I know people who've worked adjacent to Stroud. They spoke well of the subcontractor he used on that mixed-use project. They didn't know it was you. He paused. I didn't make the connection either. I know, I said. I didn't tell you. Why not? Because I was waiting for it to be undeniable, I said. I thought if I built something big enough, it would close the argument without me having to have the argument. I looked at him. That was also a mistake. He looked at me for a long moment. Something behind his eyes was recalibrating, the specific internal adjustment that a very precise person makes when data has arrived that conflicts with a model they built quickly and defended for too long. I have not been fair to you, he said. His voice was deliberate, not apologetic in the performative sense, just precise. He had reached a finding. No, I said. You haven't. I was protecting her. I know. You were protecting the wrong thing. A pause. He took that without deflecting. She knows, he said. Elena, she's known for some time that I've been wrong about you. She didn't know how to tell me. She's been managing both of us, I said. She's been doing it for 3 years and she's tired. She needs us to manage ourselves. He looked at me. Then he looked at the ceiling for a long moment, and when he looked back, something in his face was different. Not open, exactly, because Marco Vasquez was not built for open. But porous. Like a structure that has found its settlement point after years of slight misalignment. She needs someone who stays, he said. Quietly, as if he were saying it to himself as much as to me. I know. Are you that person? Again, not quite a question. The period instead of the question mark. I've been in that waiting room for 26 hours, I said. You can decide. The procedure the next morning lasted 3 hours and 12 minutes. I know, because I was watching the clock above the waiting room television that was showing a morning program with the sound off. Elena sat beside me with her hand in mine. And at some point her head went to my shoulder, and eventually she slept. I sat still. The clock moved. Patricia sat on Elena's other side, reading something on her phone and occasionally putting a hand on Elena's knee. When the cardiologist came through the doors and said the procedure had gone as planned and Marco was stable, Elena exhaled in the particular way of someone releasing something they've been holding for longer than the last 3 hours. Her whole body changed. She pressed her forehead against my shoulder and said something I couldn't quite hear, and I said I know, and held on. Marco came home on day 6. I drove them. Front seat for me. Back seat for Marco per doctor's instructions. Elena navigating from the passenger side with the discharge papers in her lap. The drive was quiet in a different way than the usual quiet between Marco and me. Not guarded, just inhabited, like a room that had been rearranged while you weren't watching and you were still getting used to where things were. He needed 2 weeks of limited activity. Elena had arranged to work from her parents' house for the first week. I came over on the 3rd day, on a Wednesday, with groceries and no agenda, and let Elena decide how long I stayed. I stayed 4 hours. Marco was in the living room with a newspaper and reading glasses, and he didn't suggest I leave, and he didn't perform warmth. But he asked me once what I thought about a particular local zoning dispute that had been in the paper. And we talked about it for 20 minutes, and it was the longest conversation we'd ever had that had nothing to do with measuring me. The day he was cleared to walk outside, 10 days after coming home, he asked me to come with him. Just around the block, at the speed the cardiologist had prescribed. Elena stood in the doorway watching us go, with an expression she didn't try to arrange into anything. We walked half a block in silence. Then, Marco said, "Patricia told me something." I waited. "She said she's watched you for 3 years. At dinners. She said she knew before I did that I had made an error." He paused to navigate a cracked section of sidewalk. "Patricia is rarely wrong about people. I tend to forget that when it's inconvenient for me. She's observant," I said. "She said you were the only person in the room at those dinners who was working for something rather than performing something." He glanced at me sideways. "I'm not sure I understood what she meant until recently. I think I was doing some of both," I said honestly. "I was working, but I was also performing the work. There's a difference." He considered this. "Yes," he said, "there is." We turned the corner and started back. The October light was thin and clean, and the leaves on the maples along the street were in the last stages of their color. Marco walked at the cardiologist's pace, deliberate, not slow. A man accustomed to his own rhythm, adjusting it under instruction. "I owe you an apology," he said, when we were almost back to his front walk. Not a prelude. The statement itself. "You don't owe me anything," I said. "I do. For the dinner. For the 3 years. For what I said to Patricia in that hallway." He stopped. Looked at me. "You heard it. Yes, I know," he said. "I've known for a while. Elena told me. Eventually, she said you'd heard it and never mentioned it." He paused. "Why?" I thought about it. "Because mentioning it would have put Alana in the middle," I said. "And she was already in the middle. I didn't want to make her feel like she had to pick a side." He was quiet for a moment. "You protected her from the fallout of my mistake," he said. "Even when you were the one I'd wronged." "I protected her because I loved her," I said. Not to make a point. He looked at me for a long moment, longer than any of the measuring looks from the first 3 years. Then he put his hand on my shoulder. Not the grip from the first dinner. Something different. The kind of contact that is an acknowledgement before the words are. "You're a good man," he said. I was too decided to see it. I'm sorry for the time I wasted in being decided. We stood there on his front walk in the October light. He took his hand off my shoulder and straightened slightly, the habitual posture of a man returning to himself after an interval of lowered defenses. "Come inside," he said. "Alina's been watching from the window for the last 10 minutes. She asked me to marry her 6 weeks later. In our apartment, on a Tuesday evening, with no ring, because she wanted us to pick it together. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I had counted those 3 seconds, the same table where I had almost made a different decision, and she looked at me with the clearest version of herself I had ever seen. "I want to marry you," she said. I should have said that more clearly, a long time ago, to a lot of people. I said yes. The word came out before anything resembling deliberation. "My father wants to apologize to you," she said. Formally, he asked me how he should do it. He already did, I said. On the walk. She looked at me. He told me. He said you didn't make him feel worse about it than he already did. It wasn't my job to make him feel worse about it, I said. It was my job to let him say it. He said it. That was enough. She reached across the table and took my hand. Outside the window, November was arranging itself. Gray sky, bare trees, the particular clarity of a season that has finished pretending. You're a strange person, she said, not unkindly. I know. You spent 3 years being disrespected by my father, and then you sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 days, and you didn't hold it over him once. I wasn't there for him, I said. I was there for you. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I know. That's what he can't get over. That's what he told Patricia. He said you weren't there for his approval, and that's how he finally knew you were the real thing. We married 11 months later. Marco Vasquez walked Elena down the aisle, and she was luminous in a way that had nothing to do with the dress. Before the ceremony, in the room where Elena was getting ready with Patricia and her 2 oldest friends, Marco found a few minutes to stand beside me in the hall. He was in good health. The procedure had held, the follow-up was clean, and he'd been doing the walking his cardiologist had prescribed with an almost competitive commitment. He looked like himself, trim, precise, posture intact, but with something different in the calibration. The measuring quality was still there. It would probably always be there. It was how he was built. But it was pointed differently now. Not at me as a question, at me as a given. I was wrong about you from the beginning, he said. I told Patricia I was protecting Elena. I was actually protecting my own picture of what was right for her. Those aren't the same thing. He straightened his jacket. I want to say that clearly once. So, it's been said. It's been said, I told him. Good, he nodded. The nod of a man closing a file. Now, come tell me how the Hartwell project is going. Patricia says you're doing the build-out, and I want to understand the scope. And we talked for 20 minutes about work. Actually talked. The way 2 people talk when one of them is genuinely curious and the other one has things worth saying. It was the most ordinary conversation I'd ever had with him. It was the best one. That's the story. Or most of it. The part I think about most often isn't in the hospital, and it isn't at the wedding. It's in the kitchen, the morning after Marco came home from the hospital, before Alana was fully awake, when I was sitting at the table with a coffee, and she came out and stood in the doorway, looking at me with the particular expression she has when she's been thinking about something since before she was all the way conscious. She poured herself a coffee and sat down across from me. The window was showing the beginning of a gray morning, the kind that would probably stay gray all day. Thank you for not going, she said. Not a specific thank you. All of it. The whole 3 years. I looked at her across the table that had heard the 3-second pause, the table that had seen the Stroud contract, the table where she had asked me to marry her, the table that had absorbed everything. I should have talked to you more, I said. About the Sundays. About what I was hearing. I thought staying quiet was protecting you, but I was actually just staying out of something that was happening to both of us. I know, she said. I should have said harder things to him earlier. I knew what was right. I was afraid of the fight. We both made mistakes, I said. We did. She wrapped her hands around her mug. We also got here. Outside the window, the gray morning was beginning to get lighter at the edges, not a dramatic sunrise, just the slow, incremental lift of October light finding its way through cloud cover. The kind of morning that doesn't announce itself. Just arrives. I wasn't going to chase you, she said quietly. if you'd left. I want to be honest about that. I was too afraid to chase. I know, I said. That's part of why I stayed. She looked at me. You stayed because I was too afraid to fight for you? I stayed because I could see who you were trying to be, I said. And she was worth it. She still is. She didn't say anything. She looked at the window, at the lightning gray, and she nodded once. The way people nod when the thing they've just heard is true and they're putting it somewhere permanent. Have you ever had someone in your life make you prove yourself for years, and then, without any ceremony, in one quiet moment, you realized they had been watching the whole time, and the proof had been accumulating without either of you naming it? And who in your life has stayed steady for you during a season when you couldn't quite bring yourself to fight for them? When you were scared or stuck or not yet sure of yourself? Leave their name in the comments. I think some people need to hear that someone is thinking of them today. If this story reached something in you, subscribe. We put out a new one every week, and some of them will find you exactly when you need them.